Hello, everybody. This is Jack Malice from MaliceCorp.com, your site for all things nerd. We're going to go ahead and do our first video today. It's going to be short and sweet and to the point, I hope. I do apologize for the low production values. We are a growing little group. This is our first YouTube video and our first attempt to bring you some good content. We're going to talk about the Raspberry Pi today and some of the initial setups. There are some, if I do say so myself, some fairly decent tutorials on stepping you through your Raspberry Pi and how to start yourself up. So this is going to be a really quick, hopefully companion piece to that. We'll have the link to those articles hopefully below in the description. So our first step is we're going to go ahead and take a look at the Pi itself, see what we can figure out, what each component is, what each port is, and then after that we'll talk about your first initial setup and doing your update, your first update, and upgrading the Pi to its newest version of software. And then after that, we'll talk about how to set up SSH and how to get into the guy. Maybe even set its hostname. So let's go take a look at Thor, the Raspberry Pi that's going to be helping us out today, and we'll move on in. Thanks, guys.
This is a Raspberry Pi, and this is Jack. We're going to take a quick look at various things we can do and how we're going to set this guy up. You can see this little guy right here. This is a micro SD card. This is the actual hard drive of our Raspberry Pi. And these little guys right here, these are adapters that'll let you connect your micro SD card to your PC if you have a card reader. A lot of the times these chips come with these guys here. They come with the micro SD cards, the adapters. Sometimes they don't. When you buy a kit like this guy came with, they often come with both, and some of them have this nice little Raspberry Pi logo on them. These two came together as a kit. They're relatively inexpensive. You can pick them up at your local electronics store. The small micro SD card actually goes into this little slot right here. Just remember when you go ahead to put them in, if it doesn't fit, don't force it. Then we have various other ports that are going to be on the Raspberry Pi. This is the power connector. It's a micro USB connector. With this is a Raspberry Pi 3B. He's going to use a 2.5 amp. Then this is the HDMI connector. Everybody's pretty familiar with HDMI. This little guy right here is going to be your 3.5 millimeter standard 4-pole audio jack. So it's pretty much just a headphone jack. It can do a lot more, but for the most part, most people are just going to use it as an audio jack. Then here, we've got the Ethernet connector, 4 USB connectors. They're USB 2s. Okay. On the top here, if we look down through the top, we have other connectors that really aren't accessible because this plastic cover that's on here. These are going to get more useful for people that are going to do more development-like stuff, as the 40-pin GPIO right here. This long bank of connectors can be used for doing analog control. We cover that stuff later. Then we also have the video port and the camera port. Those are located here and here on the tops. They're a little harder to see through the plastic cover, but those guys are going to be used for connecting either a camera or external video. Really, that's only, again, used for more high-end developing stuff. For the most part, everybody's going to use the HDMI connector for their video. But that being said, let's move on.
Okay, on our next step here, we've connected the Raspberry Pi to a keyboard, mouse, and monitor. And after boot, we get Noobs. This is Noobs version 2.2. It's the latest version of Noobs that's out there right now. May not be by the time you see this, but this is the latest version of Noobs. This is a nice piece of software that was developed by the Raspberry Pi Foundation. It comes preloaded on almost all versions of the Raspberry Pi when you buy them as a kit on a micro SD card. If you didn't buy it as a kit and it didn't come with a micro SD card, you're going to need to get your hands on Noobs, which we'll cover in a different article or a different video. But if you've got the preloaded one, we're good to go. Once you've booted up and you see the Noobs menu here, all we're going to do is, for our purposes, we're going to use the Raspbian, which is the very top selection at the top. Go ahead and select that little, click that little X that's up at the top, and then you click the install button at the top or press I, and it's off to the races. It's now going to go ahead and install Raspbian onto your Raspberry Pi or onto the micro SD card. It will wipe out Noobs the first time you do this, so Noobs will be gone. But like I said, Noobs is easy to get your hands on. It's free, and it's provided by the Raspberry Foundation, Raspberry Pi Foundation. We're good to go. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, everybody, after you go ahead and use Noobs to install Raspbian on your Pi, it's going to boot back up and it's going to give you a desktop. It's going to look something like this. This is the standard, current standard, at least at this time, of the Raspbian GUI for Raspbian. A little redundant there. We're almost there. This guy is usable at this point. He can actually do what he needs to do. If you wanted to leave him as a standalone keyboard, mouse, desktop computer, he can be used this way. But really, we won't find the true power of the Pi until we can set up and use command line interface stuff. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and hit this guy, the terminal. We're going to pop up the terminal, and we're going to grab a little piece of information that we're going to need later on to be able to putty into this guy, or SSH via putty. We're going to need the Ifconfig. So go ahead and get that real quick. We just type in Ifconfig, just like I did right there, Ifconfig. And then if you look right down here, it's going to give you the IP address of your actual Pi right there. It's going to be different for you. It's going to be different for everybody. Thor is set up with a static IP, which is something I can cover later and probably will in a different tutorial video. That lets me find him anytime I want because he's always going to have that IP address. But whatever your IP address is, you're going to go ahead and capture that right now. Now, if you don't see an IP address, that means you don't have them plugged into a router or a switch. And you're going to need to plug them into a router or a switch. That IP address, unless it's set up as a static IP like I have now for Thor here, it's going to be dynamically chosen by your router. That's fine. It's perfectly fine to do that. The issue, though, you run into is if for some reason you reboot the Pi and that IP address is no longer available on your home network because another component has taken it, you're going to be hard to find him. If you do get to that point and you can't find it, you can always log into your router. Almost every single home use router has a web interface. You just open up a browser and type in the IP address of your router. It's going to be 192.168 something.1 normally, depending upon whether you've messed with your home settings. But if you haven't, it's usually 192.168.0.1 or 1.1. But you could always check with your manufacturer. Their website will have a nice manual to help you log into it. Once you're logged into your router, which I suggest everybody does at least once, so they can change their password on their router at the very least. You can look at your connected devices and see the Pi, especially if you've set up the host name. If you've changed the host name, which we're going to get to in a moment, it'll be very easy to identify and see where your Pi is and what its IP address is. So our next step here is going to be sudo raspi-config. Go ahead and run sudo raspi-config, and that lets us change some stuff. Number one right here lets us change the password for the Raspberry Pi. The default username and password for a Raspberry Pi is a username Pi, P-I, and the password Raspberry. So everybody knows it now. You're definitely going to want to change your Raspberry Pi's username. The next thing is you could change the host name. This is Thor. I'm not going to want to mess with him, but if you set your host name, it does make it very easy to find him later on. If you do lose the IP address, you can just go to your router and find him on the connected devices based upon the host name. Makes it jump right out. Then we have the localization options here. This lets us set a couple of different things. The language of the Pi, the time zone of the Pi, the keyboard, and the layout. You're definitely going to want to set the time zone up so it knows what time zone it's in, so it keeps the correct time. And then the very last thing is going to be our interfacing options. We're going to go ahead and bring that guy up, and we're going to want the Ssh Daemon. So we go ahead and hit SSH, and do we want to turn it on? We hit yes, and now we're good to go. And we can go ahead and go back to finish. And there we go. The daemon is now turned on. The Raspberry Pi SSH server is turned on. So now we don't have to have the keyboard, the mouse, and the monitor connected. You can just go ahead and remove all that stuff, and then we'll be able to reach him via the Putty terminal and work with the Pi without all that other stuff connected. So we're going to go ahead and move on to that step, and we'll take a look at it. Okay, our next step is to connect to the Pi via Putty using an SSH session. So you're going to need to get Putty. The directions for how to get Putty can be found on MaliceCorp.com on the article this is a companion piece to. So the next step is to go ahead and fire up Putty. This is the Putty configuration window. The first thing we need to do is get the IP address that we recorded earlier and type it in here. But we're also going to add pi at 192.168.1.200. The pi is the username, so we're going to go ahead and do a little shortcut. That's not really required, but that lets us not have to type in the username every time. It just automatically pi at the IP address of our pi. So we go ahead and hit open, and that's going to go ahead and connect. So you can see that it says you connecting username pi. So again, now we're logged in, or we're going to get logged in. We can see that it's ready to go. It just needs its password. The password default is going to be Raspberry, unless you changed it through the Raspberry config. But like I said, recommend you do that. So we go ahead. Now we're here. We have our actual prompt. We have a command line level prompt. We're ready to actually start doing some cool stuff. Kind of. Next step is we have to update the Pi. So we're going to do sudo apt-get update. This command would go ahead and run out, have the Pi check all the repository websites that are listed in its configurations, find out if there's been any changes to those URLs or whatnot. So we'd go ahead and run that, and it would reach out and go and do its thing. It could take a while, but we're going to go ahead and stop that. So, and Control Z will stop that. So, but we want to stop it so we don't move on. So then the next one would be sudo apt-get upgrade. Oops, upgrade, if we can spell correctly today. And we go ahead and run that. And now, based upon all those repositories that went out and updated, it's going to come up and say, find what it needs to update. This could take a while, and it could take a long time. But when it does pop up and say, do you want to continue, yes or no, you would hit yes. I don't want to update Thor. I like him the way he is, so I'm going to hit no. And that's going to stop it. Now, your Pi is set up. That's your initial basic setup. From there on out, everything else is building up whatever you want to use the Pi for. So thanks for tuning in. Take a look at us over at MaliceCorp.com. Like us and share us with your friends. If you have more questions, have something you want me to cover, I didn't cover something clearly, or you just don't like, as my friends call it, my creepy Darth Vader voice with it is what it is, feel free to comment below. Check us out on MaliceCorp.com. Ask questions. Everybody enjoy your Pi and have fun.